December 7th, 1941, a date which would live in infamy. But while history remembers Pearl Harbor as the moment America entered World War II, there's another story that began that day, one that would fundamentally transform American society forever. It's the story of millions of women who left their kitchens, their living rooms, their traditional roles, and walked into factories, shipyards, and assembly lines to build the greatest war machine the world had ever seen. This is the story of Rosie the Riveter. But more than that, it's the story of real women with real names, real struggles, and real courage. Women like Monroe, Naomi Fraley, and millions of others whose hands literally forged victory. Their story has been simplified, romanticized, and sometimes forgotten. Today, we're going to tell it the way it really happened. Picture America in late 1941. The nation had been watching Europe tear itself apart for over 2 years. France had fallen. Britain stood alone against the Nazi onslaught. The Soviet Union was bleeding from Operation Barbarossa. But America remained officially neutral, though factories were already humming, building weapons and supplies for Britain through the Lend-Lease program. Then came December 7th. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor killed over 2,400 Americans and destroyed or damaged nearly 20 American ships. The next day, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war. 4 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America was now fighting a two-front war across 2 oceans, and the nation was completely unprepared. The numbers were staggering. The military needed tens of thousands of aircraft, tanks, ships, guns, ammunition, uniforms, everything required to fight the most technologically advanced war in human history. The Roosevelt administration set goals that seemed impossible. 60,000 planes in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, thousands of tanks, hundreds of ships, mountains of ammunition. But there was a problem, a massive problem. America didn't have enough workers. Before Pearl Harbor, unemployment had finally been dropping after the Great Depression, but millions of men were already in the military or about to be drafted. The Selective Service would eventually call up over 16 million men. That left a gaping hole in the workforce, precisely when American industry needed to expand to unprecedented levels. The solution seemed obvious to government officials and factory owners, though it would have seemed radical just months earlier. Women would have to fill those jobs. Now, women had always worked in America. Poor women, immigrant women, women of color, they had labored in fields, factories, and other people's homes for generations. But middle-class white women, the women who dominated popular culture and social expectations, were expected to stay home. A woman's place was in the domestic sphere, raising children, maintaining the home, supporting her husband. The war changed everything. Suddenly, the same society that had insisted women couldn't possibly do men's work now desperately needed them to do exactly that. The recruitment campaign began almost immediately. The War Manpower Commission, established in April 1942, coordinated efforts to mobilize workers for war industries. But they faced a challenge. How do you convince millions of women to take jobs they'd been told their entire lives they couldn't and shouldn't do? The answer was one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in American history. The government partnered with advertising agencies, Hollywood studios, and media companies to create a massive recruitment effort. Posters appeared everywhere. Magazine advertisements showed attractive, well-groomed women in factory settings. Radio programs featured dramatic stories about women war workers. Movie newsreels highlighted their contributions. The message was carefully crafted. Working in a war factory wasn't unfeminine or improper. It was patriotic. It was temporary, just for the duration of the war. It was supporting your husband, brother, or son fighting overseas. Most importantly, it was urgent. America needed you. One of the most famous images from this campaign would become iconic: a woman in a red polka dot bandana flexing her arm with the caption, "We can do it." This image, created by artist J. Howard Miller for the Westinghouse Electric Corporation in 1943, would later become synonymous with Rosie the Riveter, though it wasn't originally created for that purpose. The actual Rosie the Riveter began as a song. In 1942, songwriters Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb wrote a tune about a woman named Rosie who worked in an aircraft factory. The song became a hit, recorded by numerous artists, including the Four Vagabonds and Kay Kaiser's orchestra. The lyrics told the story of Rosie, who was making history, working for victory, and protecting her boyfriend Charlie, who was in the Marines. Following the song's success, the Saturday Evening Post, one of America's most popular magazines, commissioned artist Norman Rockwell to create a painting for their May 29, 1943 cover. Rockwell's Rosie was powerful and muscular, sitting during her lunch break with a rivet gun across her lap and her foot resting on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. She was eating a sandwich, looking confident and capable. This image reached millions of American homes. But who was the real Rosie? That's where the story gets interesting, because there were several women who claimed to be or were identified as the inspiration for Rosie the Riveter. Roseville Monroe was perhaps the most famous. Born in 1920 in Kentucky, Rose had a hard life early on. Her mother died when she was young, and she was raised by her grandparents. She married young, had 2 daughters, and then tragedy struck. Her husband died in a car accident in 1941. Widowed with 2 small children at the start of the war, Rose needed work. She heard about high-paying jobs at the Willow Run aircraft factory in Ypsilanti, Michigan, where Ford Motor Company was building B-24 Liberator bombers. She moved north, found someone to watch her children, and got a job as a riveter. Willow Run was an industrial marvel. Henry Ford had designed the factory to use assembly line techniques to build bombers. The main assembly building was over 3 million square feet, one of the largest buildings under one roof in the world at the time.
At peak production, the factory was producing 1 complete B-24 every hour. Rose worked on the night shift, installing rivets on the bomber's fuselages. It was hard, demanding work. Riveting required strength, precision, and stamina. Workers had to hold heavy pneumatic rivet guns for hours, working in cramped spaces, often on scaffolding or inside partially completed aircraft. The noise was deafening. Metal shavings were everywhere. In winter, the massive factory was cold. In summer, it was sweltering. But Rose was good at it. She was skilled, reliable, and strong. In 1943, actor Walter Pidgeon was touring the factory as part of a promotional film to encourage war bond sales. Someone pointed out Rose as an excellent example of women war workers. She was filmed riveting, and she even got to deliver a line encouraging Americans to buy war bonds. That footage made Roseville Monroe famous. She became a symbol of women war workers, appearing in additional promotional materials and even meeting with celebrities and politicians. After the war, she used her savings to buy a taxi and later founded a construction company, driving bulldozers and heavy equipment herself. She remained proud of her wartime service until her death in 1997. But Roseville Monroe might not have been the original Rosie. In 2016, another candidate emerged, Naomi Parker Fraley. In 1942, Naomi and her sister Ada were working at the Naval Air Station in Alameda, California. A photographer captured Naomi working at a lathe, wearing a polka dot bandana. That photograph appeared in newspapers and might have been the inspiration for the "We Can Do It" poster. For decades, that photograph was misidentified as showing another woman, Geraldine Hoff Doyle. But researchers eventually traced it back to Naomi. When she was finally recognized before her death in 2018, Naomi said she was proud to have possibly inspired the iconic image. But she emphasized that millions of women did similar work and deserved recognition. And she was absolutely right. By 1943, over 19 million women were in the workforce, a 57% increase from 1940. About 3 million worked in war industries. They weren't just riveters. They were welders, electricians, mechanics, crane operators, ship fitters, munitions workers, and more. They worked in every war industry, building everything from bullets to battleships. Let me take you inside one of these factories.
Let's visit the Bethlehem-Fairfield shipyard in Baltimore, Maryland. Before the war, shipbuilding was exclusively male work, hard, dangerous, skilled labor that supposedly required strength women didn't possess. By 1943, women made up a significant portion of the workforce at Bethlehem-Fairfield and shipyards across the country. The shipyard operated 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. The morning shift began at 7 a.m. Women arrived wearing practical clothes, usually pants, which many women had never worn before in public. They wore bandanas or turbans to keep their hair away from machinery. They carried lunch pails, just like the men. On the ways, the massive structures where ships were built, workers swarmed over the partially completed vessels like ants on a hill.
The air was filled with the sound of hammers, rivet guns, welding torches, and the shouts of foremen. Sparks from welding torches created cascades of light. Cranes lifted massive steel plates into position. Women worked at every level. Some were on scaffolding high above the ground, welding or riveting steel plates. Others worked inside the ships, in cramped compartments, running electrical wiring or installing pipes. Ship fitting required working in tight spaces, which sometimes made smaller women particularly valuable for certain jobs. The work was dangerous. Sparks could cause burns. Heavy equipment could crush. Falls from scaffolding could kill. Every shipyard had injuries and sometimes fatalities. Women faced all the same dangers men did, plus some additional ones. Some male workers resented female colleagues and created hostile environments. Sexual harassment was common and rarely addressed. But the ships got built. Liberty ships, cargo vessels designed for rapid construction, were being produced at an incredible rate. The record was set in 1942 when the SS Robert E. Peary was built in just 4 days and 15 hours, from keel laying to launch. Women's hands helped build that ship and thousands of others. At the Boeing plant in Seattle, women built B-17 flying fortresses. The B-17 was one of the war's most important aircraft, a 4-engine heavy bomber that carried the air war to Nazi Germany. Each plane was incredibly complex, with thousands of parts, hundreds of instruments, miles of wiring, and intricate systems for engines, hydraulics, oxygen, and weapons. Assembly required extraordinary precision. Tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. A rivet installed incorrectly could lead to structural failure. A wire connected wrong could cause a system to fail. When these planes flew into combat, men's lives depended on the quality of the work. Women proved they could meet these standards. Quality control records show that female workers' error rates were no higher than male workers, and in some cases, lower. Supervisors reported that women were often more patient with detailed, precise work and more conscientious about following procedures exactly. Let me introduce you to some individual women whose stories deserve to be remembered. There was Constance Bowman, a school teacher who took a summer job at a San Diego aircraft factory in 1942. She found the work fascinating and empowering. She later wrote a book about her experiences called Slacks and Calluses, describing the challenges and satisfactions of factory work. She wrote about the physical transformation, developing muscles and calluses she'd never had. She wrote about the pride of seeing aircraft she'd worked on roll out of the factory. She also wrote honestly about the difficulties, the exhaustion, the injuries, the condescension from some male workers who believed women didn't belong there. There were the Ford girls, thousands of women who worked at Ford's bomber plant at Willow Run. They came from all over the country, drawn by wages that could be twice what they'd earned in traditional women's work. Many had never been away from home before. They lived in hastily constructed dormitories or crowded into rented rooms in Ypsilanti.
They worked long shifts, often overtime, sending money home to families. They dealt with loneliness, homesickness, and exhaustion. But they also experienced independence and competence many had never known.
Then there were the women of color, whose contributions were doubly marginalized, discriminated against both for being women and for their race. African American women faced particular challenges. Before the war, most black women who worked outside their homes were relegated to domestic service or agricultural labor. Even as the war created labor shortages, many defense contractors initially refused to hire black workers, and those who did often restricted them to the lowest-paying, most undesirable positions. Civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph pressured the Roosevelt administration to address this discrimination. In June 1941, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, prohibiting racial discrimination in the defense industry. It was the first federal action addressing civil rights since Reconstruction. The order didn't end discrimination, far from it, but it opened doors. African American women began getting hired in war industries. By 1945, over 600,000 black women worked in industrial jobs. For many, these were the first opportunities to escape domestic service. At shipyards, aircraft factories, and munitions plants across the country, African American women proved their capabilities. But they often faced segregated facilities, hostility from white workers, and assignments to the hardest, dirtiest jobs. Some workplaces experienced hate strikes when white workers walked out to protest the hiring or promotion of black workers. Despite these obstacles, black women persevered. They saw their work as serving multiple purposes: supporting the war effort, supporting their families, and challenging the racial barriers that limited their opportunities. Many were active in the civil rights organizations that were laying the groundwork for the post-war civil rights movement. Hispanic women also contributed significantly. In California and the Southwest, Mexican American women worked in aircraft factories and other war industries. They too faced discrimination and stereotyping, but proved their worth through skill and dedication. Native American women left reservations to work in war industries, often experiencing urban life for the first time. Asian American women, despite the internment of Japanese Americans, also participated in the war effort, with Chinese American and Filipino American women working in factories and supporting the war against Japan. The work wasn't just in factories. Women operated heavy machinery, drove trucks and buses, worked as lumberjacks, yes, lumberjacks, in the Women's Timber Corps, clearing forests to provide lumber for war construction. They worked in steel mills, foundries, and refineries. They loaded cargo ships, worked in rail yards, and maintained aircraft. Some jobs were particularly dangerous. Munitions work, loading shells, assembling bombs, handling explosives, carried constant risk. Accidents did happen. In July 1945, an explosion at a munitions depot in Port Chicago, California, killed 320 people, mostly African American sailors and civilian workers.
Throughout the war, industrial accidents claimed lives, and women were among the casualties. Let's talk about what daily life was like for these women. First, the physical demands were enormous. Most of these women had never done physical labor like this. Teachers, secretaries, waitresses, housewives, whatever they'd done before, it rarely prepared them for 10 or 12-hour shifts doing heavy industrial work. The first weeks were brutal. Muscles they didn't know they had would ache. Hands would blister. Feet would swell. Many wanted to quit, but most didn't. They adapted. They grew stronger. They learned techniques to make the work easier. They developed camaraderie with coworkers that helped them through the hard days, and they took pride in what they were accomplishing. Second, there was the constant juggling of responsibilities. Unlike male workers, women weren't relieved of their domestic duties. Society still expected them to maintain homes, care for children, and serve their families. For married women with children, this meant working an 8 or 10-hour factory shift, then coming home to cook, clean, and care for kids. Essentially, they were working 2 full-time jobs. The government recognized this problem to some extent. Some factories offered on-site childcare.
The Kaiser shipyards in Portland, Oregon, ran 2 24-hour childcare centers that served up to 1,125 children. These were exceptional facilities, with trained staff, educational programs, and even infirmaries for sick children. But such programs were rare. Most working mothers relied on relatives, neighbors, or older children to watch younger ones. Some left children alone. The latchkey kid phenomenon, children coming home to empty houses, became common. Social critics worried about neglected children and juvenile delinquency, blaming working mothers rather than the circumstances of war. Third, there was the social aspect. For many women, working in war industries was liberating. They earned their own money, good money. Wages in war industries were substantially higher than in traditional women's work. A riveter or welder could earn $40 or $50 a week or more, compared to $20 a week or less for secretarial or retail work. This economic independence was empowering. Women could support themselves and their families. They could save money. They could buy things they wanted without having to ask a father or husband for permission. For young single women especially, this was transformative. The social environment was also different from traditional women's workplaces. Factories were loud, rough, informal places. Language was coarse, behavior was casual. Women adapted to this culture, learning to give as good as they got, standing up for themselves, developing thick skins. Many women made close friendships with coworkers. They socialized after shifts, went to movies or dances together, supported each other through personal crises. These bonds were real and lasting. Decades later, former war workers would remember their coworkers with affection and the sense of purpose they'd shared. Fourth, there was fashion, or rather the transformation of it. Women's fashion before the war emphasized femininity. Dresses, skirts, heels, carefully styled hair, makeup.
You couldn't work on a factory floor dressed like that. Pants became acceptable for women for the first time in mainstream American culture. Denim work pants, coveralls, sturdy boots, these became the uniform of women war workers. Hair had to be covered and tied back. Loose clothing could catch in machinery. Long nails would break. Heavy makeup would run with sweat. Some women struggled with this. They'd been taught that femininity was essential to their identity and worth. Dressing like a man felt wrong. But necessity won out, and many women discovered they actually preferred practical clothing. Why struggle with garters and stockings when you could wear comfortable pants? The government and media tried to help with this transition. Fashion articles showed women how to maintain femininity while dressing for factory work. Beauty and overalls became a theme. You could wear work clothes but still use makeup, style your hair attractively, and maintain your feminine identity. This might seem trivial, but it wasn't. The negotiation between doing traditionally masculine work and maintaining feminine identity was psychologically important. Women were being asked to violate gender norms that had been presented as natural and unchangeable. Finding ways to do so while still feeling like women was a real challenge. Now let's talk about something the propaganda posters rarely showed: resistance and hostility from men. Not all men welcomed women into war industries. Many male workers resented female co-workers, viewing them as threats to male jobs and male identity. Skilled trades like machining, welding, and electrical work had been male preserves, with strong union traditions and masculine culture. Women's entry into these fields was seen as an invasion. This resistance took many forms. Some men refused to train women properly, setting them up to fail. Some sabotaged women's work. Some subjected women to constant harassment, crude jokes, and sexual advances. Some unions negotiated to keep women out of certain jobs or to ensure they'd be fired once the war ended. Management often contributed to these problems. Many companies paid women less than men for the same work, justifying it with various excuses. Some employers assigned women to separate job classifications with lower wage scales. When unions challenged this, companies argued that women weren't as productive or that they needed male supervisors, which justified lower pay. The National War Labor Board officially endorsed equal pay for equal work in 1942, but enforcement was weak. On average, women in war industries earned about 60% of what men earned. Some of this reflected assignment to lower-level positions, but much was simple discrimination. Sexual harassment was pervasive and rarely addressed. Women were expected to tolerate crude comments, unwanted touching, and persistent advances. Complaining could lead to retaliation or firing. Many women developed strategies to fend off unwanted attention while trying not to offend male coworkers whose cooperation they needed. Yet many male workers were supportive. Some genuinely welcomed female colleagues and respected their abilities. Some male supervisors advocated for women, ensuring they received proper training and fair treatment.
Male workers and female workers often developed good working relationships based on mutual respect and shared purpose, and the work got done. Despite all the challenges, discrimination, and obstacles, American industry produced material on a scale that amazed the world and overwhelmed the Axis powers. The numbers are staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks, 6,500 naval vessels, 5,600 merchant ships, 12 million rifles and carbines, 40 billion bullets. This was more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. This industrial output allowed America to equip not just its own forces, but also to supply Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies through Lend-Lease. Women's hands built a huge portion of this material. Every third aircraft had substantial female labor in its construction. Women's welding helped build the Liberty ships that carried supplies across the Atlantic. Women's assembly work produced the ammunition that American soldiers fired. This wasn't secret. The title of this video is somewhat tongue-in-cheek. The government publicized women's contributions as part of the recruitment effort. But after the war, this contribution was quickly forgotten or minimized. The cultural memory preserved Rosie the Riveter as an icon, but the real women's stories faded. As the war progressed and victory became increasingly certain, attitudes began to shift. By 1944, there was growing discussion about what would happen after the war. Would women keep these jobs? Should they? The answer from most quarters was clear: no. These jobs were temporary, for the war emergency only. Once the war ended, women should return home, making way for returning servicemen who would need jobs. This message began appearing in media. Articles discussed the importance of women returning to domestic life. Experts warned about the dangers of neglected children and unstable homes if women continued working. Employers made clear that women would be laid off when war production ended. Some women were ready to go home. The work was hard, the hours long, and many had taken these jobs out of patriotic duty or financial necessity, not preference. They looked forward to their husbands returning and life getting back to normal, or as normal as possible after such a devastating war. But many women wanted to keep working. They discovered they were good at these jobs. They liked the income, the independence, and the sense of accomplishment. Surveys showed that 75 to 80% of women war workers wanted to keep their jobs after the war. It didn't matter. When the war ended, women were laid off en masse. At Ford's Willow Run plant, women went from being thousands of the workforce to essentially none within months. At shipyards across the country, the pattern repeated. As military contracts were canceled and production slowed, women were the first fired. Unions, which might have protected these workers, largely didn't. Many unions had only reluctantly accepted women members and were happy to see them go. Seniority systems, which might have protected some women, were often waived to prioritize male workers.
The government assisted this transition, or rather this expulsion of women from industrial work. Propaganda that had urged women to take these jobs now urged them to leave. Public service announcements and magazine articles emphasized that women's true calling was domestic. The same culture that had created Rosie the Riveter now created the idealized post-war housewife.
Many women fought to keep their jobs. They filed grievances, protested, argued that they deserved to keep the positions they'd earned. Some succeeded temporarily, but the tide was against them. By 1946, women's participation in the industrial workforce had dropped dramatically. This didn't mean women left the workforce entirely. Many continued working, but they were pushed back into traditionally female jobs: secretarial work, retail, service industries, teaching, nursing. These jobs paid less and offered fewer opportunities for advancement than the war work had. The women who had been Rosie the Riveter became secretaries, waitresses, shopgirls, or they became full-time housewives and mothers. The 1950s ideal of suburban domesticity, the woman in the kitchen wearing pearls and heels, greeting her husband with a martini, was partly a deliberate cultural response to the upheaval of the war years. But the experience hadn't been forgotten, even if the culture tried to minimize it. The women who had worked in war industries knew what they'd accomplished. They knew they were capable of more than society typically allowed them. They'd experienced economic independence. They'd proven they could do men's work. This knowledge didn't disappear. Many of these women raised daughters in the 1950s and 60s. When those daughters began challenging gender restrictions in the 1960s and 70s, their mothers often supported them. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s had roots in World War II, even if it took 2 decades for those seeds to sprout. Rose Monroe, the riveter who became famous, never forgot what she'd accomplished. After the war, she didn't return to traditional women's work. She drove a cab, then a taxi service, then founded a construction company. She operated heavy machinery, drove trucks, and ran her own business. When reporters asked her about it, she'd say that if she could build bombers, she could certainly drive a bulldozer. The Rosie the Riveter image was resurrected in the 1980s by the feminist movement. The "We Can Do It" poster, which had been virtually forgotten, became an icon of women's empowerment. It appeared on t-shirts, posters, and protest signs. Rosie became a symbol of women's capability and strength. This resurrection was both appropriate and ironic. Appropriate because those women war workers really had demonstrated extraordinary capability. Ironic because the original campaign wasn't about women's empowerment. It was about getting women into factories for the duration of the war, after which they were expected to leave. But symbols take on their own meaning. Today, Rosie the Riveter represents something important: the idea that women can do anything, that gender limitations are social constructs rather than natural facts, that women deserve equal opportunity and recognition.
The real women behind the symbol deserve to be remembered, not just as icons, but as individuals. They were teenagers and grandmothers, single women and mothers, white women and women of color, native-born and immigrant. They came from farms and cities, from wealth and poverty. What they shared was a moment in history when their country needed them, and they answered the call. They weren't perfect. They had prejudices and limitations. The era's racism meant that white women war workers often supported segregation and discrimination against black co-workers. Class divisions persisted. Not all women workers were committed to lasting change in gender roles. Many genuinely believed their work was temporary and appropriate gender relations should resume after the war. But they also accomplished something genuinely remarkable. They proved that women could do work they'd been told was impossible for them. They showed that capability isn't determined by gender. They helped win the most important war in modern history. And though the immediate post-war years saw retrenchment, the long-term impact of their contribution continued to resonate. Today, women work in every occupation, including the military roles and industrial jobs that were closed to them before World War II. Women are welders, electricians, heavy equipment operators, pilots, and engineers. This didn't happen automatically or easily. It required decades of activism and continued struggle. But the precedent set by the women war workers of World War II mattered. When modern women work in traditionally male fields, they're following a path that was first blazed by the women who built B-24s at Willow Run, welded Liberty ships in Baltimore, and loaded bombs in munitions plants across America. The story of Rosie the Riveter isn't really secret. It was widely publicized at the time. But it was forgotten or remembered in simplified form. The real story is more complex, more challenging, and ultimately more inspiring than the iconic image suggests. It's a story about ordinary women doing extraordinary things. It's about breaking barriers while also reinforcing some and confronting others only partially. It's about the gap between propaganda and reality, between what women accomplished and how they were treated. It's about women like Monroe, who riveted bombers and then built a life of independence and accomplishment. Like Naomi Fraley, who operated a lathe and possibly inspired an icon. Like the thousands of African American women who fought both fascism abroad and racism at home. Like all the women whose names we don't know, but whose work helped secure victory. These women built America's war machine. They built it with skill, with strength, with dedication. They built it despite being told they couldn't. They built it while facing discrimination and harassment. They built it while managing households and raising children. They built it knowing that once it had served its purpose, they'd likely be cast aside. And they built it anyway. Because their country was at war, because their loved ones were in danger. Because the alternative, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan dominating the world, was unthinkable. Because they could, even though they'd been told they couldn't.
The rivets they installed still hold together aircraft in museums. The ships they built carried soldiers to victory and goods to rebuild a shattered world. The bullets they made stopped tyranny. The impact of what they did can't be calculated, but it was real and essential. So when you see that image of Rosie the Riveter, flexing her arm, bandana on her head, confident and capable, remember the real women behind it. Remember their names when you can. Remember their struggles and their triumphs. Remember that they proved something important about human capability and potential. And remember that when your country tells you that you can't do something because of who you are, sometimes the right response is to roll up your sleeves, tie back your hair, and prove them wrong. That's the real legacy of Rosie the Riveter. Not that women did men's work temporarily during an emergency, but that women can do anything. That gender limitations are artificial. That capability isn't about chromosomes, but about opportunity, training, and determination. The women who built America's war machine in World War II weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who rose to an extraordinary challenge. They were tired, sometimes frightened, often frustrated. They dealt with physical pain, emotional stress, and social pressure. They weren't always heroic or noble, they were human. But they did the job. They showed up, day after day, shift after shift. They learned skills they'd never imagined learning. They adapted to environments they'd never expected to work in. They persisted through difficulty and discrimination. And in doing so, they helped save the world and showed what women could do when given the chance. That's worth remembering, that's worth celebrating, and that's worth continuing. Not just remembering what they did, but continuing to break down barriers, challenge limitations, and prove that capability knows no gender. The war ended 78 years ago. Most of the women who were Rosie the Riveter are gone now, but their legacy remains. Every woman in a non-traditional career, every girl who dreams of being an engineer or pilot or welder, every person who challenges gender limitations, they're all inheritors of what those women accomplished. So here's to Rosie the Riveter, all the Rosies, by whatever names they went. The women who secretly built America's war machine. Except it wasn't really secret at all. They did it right out in the open, in factories and shipyards across the nation. They did it with skill and strength and determination, and they changed America forever. We can do it. They proved it, and that proof remains, a legacy and a challenge for every generation since.